Good morning and welcome to the first of Systra's webinar series, which is entitled The Road to Zero Carbon via COP26. As I say, today is the first in a series of 6 webinars in each of the months running up to COP26. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Boris Johansson and I'm Systra's UK and Ireland Director for Transport Planning. It gives me great pleasure to welcome such a wide-ranging group of participants from right across the industry today. We're really delighted at the healthy turnout. I can see the numbers scrolling upwards all the time, but we really do have an excellent turnout, so that's great. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge our partners at Landor for their work in arranging these webinars, so many thanks for this. Today we've assembled a high-quality panel, including external speakers. We have Lucy Yu, the CEO of the Centre for Net Zero, and Ewa Kmietowicz, the team leader for transport at the Committee on Climate Change. They will be supported by various Systra experts, and all speakers will give themselves an introduction in due course, so I won't say anything further about them right now. Whatever your viewpoint, the climate emergency agenda is clearly growing in prominence, and it will have a much greater influence on decision-making for the next decade and beyond. The transport sector will undoubtedly be subject to change as a result of this, but this, I would say, presents a unique opportunity for us to be at the forefront of positive change in travel behaviour characteristics and in planning and developing our built environment and critical infrastructure. We already see the influence of climate emergency as individuals, businesses, and organisational policy changes. A couple of examples at Systra include the fact that all carbon calculated for business commuter travel, energy consumption, waste production for each office is a critical part of our plan for net zero that will enable us to offset our carbon emissions. We also have a dedicated climate emergency sector, which is headed up by Duncan Irons, and this focuses on supporting clients to undertake the relevant research and consultation, to develop strategies and business cases, and to design and implement the measures required to achieve net zero and mitigate climate change impacts. Today's webinar, entitled Carbon, Climate, What's the Emergency?, will provide a rounded introduction to the climate emergency agenda. The next 2 webinars will be on Thursday the 20th of May and Thursday the 24th of June, with formal agendas for those to follow. We really hope that today's session will generate useful and active debate. So I'd just like to finally say thanks again for your attendance, and I'll now pass you over to my colleague Katie Hall, who's going to facilitate today's discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Boris. So this morning we're going to have a packed agenda. I'm keen to get started quickly. So for anyone that's not speaking, please make sure your microphones and cameras are switched off. Just a reminder that the session is being recorded and the link will be available to all attendees a few hours after this is finished, and also available on the Landor YouTube channel for catch-up later on. I'm certainly very keen to get audience participation and interaction as much as possible, so please do use the question function to add your questions for our speakers. I'll do my very best to field them to the different speakers that we have, and later on to the Systra panel as well. So I would like to get started straight away and welcome our first speaker, please, Lucy Yu.
Thanks very much, Katie. So morning all, thanks for having me. I run the Centre for Net Zero, founded by Octopus Energy. Is this the first cover slide? So we're an open research lab using modelling and simulation to help move the world to net zero as quickly, fairly and affordably as we can. I'm also an advisor to Voy Technology, which is the largest micromobility operator in the UK. And before I moved to energy, I spent many years in different transport roles, and I'm really seeing for myself the effect of some of the very significant developments in technology that we've seen over the past decade or so, but also probably as importantly or more importantly, shifts in people's attitudes and behaviours that have shaped transport over the past decade. We all know this is set to continue. And a large part of that, the reason for that is the need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in order to prevent very catastrophic climate change. And when we talk about net zero, what we really mean is balancing all of the greenhouse gases that we're producing and emitting into the atmosphere with those that we remove. So we have a net zero effect. So let's look at what that means in reality. If we could move to, thank you, next slide. That's great. So these graphs are from the Climate Change Committee. They're taken from the 6th Carbon Budget Report, which was published last December. And in that report, the Climate Change Committee highlights key targets that the UK will need to reach to achieve its net zero targets. And a key figure is a 78% reduction in emissions by 2035 compared to a 1990 baseline. Now, these two graphs have slightly later baselines, 2020 for the graph on the left there and 2019 for the graph on the right. If we look at the left graph first, the left, the vertical axis, is metric tons equivalents of carbon dioxide, and along the bottom you can see progression of the years. Now, the Climate Change Committee's report is incredibly detailed. Their modelling covers hundreds of scenarios, but the key point to know is that in all of their scenarios, emissions reductions need to occur across every sector of the economy. And this you can see on the very left here with the legend showing all of the different sectors. So from transport to agriculture, manufacturing, buildings, and so on and so forth. Now, as you can see here on the graph on the right, there are some sectors for which the absolute reductions in emissions will need to be higher in the next 15 years than for other sectors. And the highest of those is this large, long purple bar on the left, and that's surface transport. So that's transport excluding aviation and shipping. So if we move to the next slide now, please. Thanks. So one of the other important points made in the SIF carbon budget is that it's not just industry and businesses who will get us to net zero, and that in order to achieve the target, individuals, and that's to say you and I, our friends and family, we all have an important role to play. Now, this pie chart that you can see here is for the Climate Change Committee's what's called their balanced pathway. So, as I mentioned previously, the Climate Change Committee models dozens of different scenarios. Some of them are more extreme than others. The balanced pathway is, as the name suggests, a scenario which is considered to be an ambitious balance of what could be achievable. And the measures that will be required to get us to net zero fall into three main categories. One of those categories, which is the dark purple one here, is one that's more or less invisible to us as individuals. So, for instance, swapping fossil fuels for renewable energy. We don't really see that as individuals. We switch on our laptops or we charge our phones. We see no difference. It makes very little difference, makes no difference whether that is renewable energy or non-renewable energy. And the good news is that we've already made good progress in this category. So over 50% of our electricity now comes from renewable sources. But that means we'll need to look to the other two categories to make additional progress. A second category, which is the small orange one here, requires consumer choice. So for instance, we might make choices to fly less perhaps, or to eat less meat, or to choose to purchase products that will last longer. Next slide, please. The largest pink category, sorry, just go back to the previous. Yep, so the largest pink category of measures is the category which is a combination of both low carbon technologies and consumer change. And examples of low carbon technologies that are relevant here are electric vehicles and electric heat pumps. And these require consumer change because many of us are still driving internal combustion engine vehicles, and we're still heating our homes using gas boilers. So we as individuals have to make decisions to invest in and adopt these technologies. And this important category, this degree of consumer change that's required, differs between different sectors. And in some sectors, it's more important than it is in others. And one of the sectors for which consumer change is overweighted, so by that I mean proportionately more important, is transport. So next slide, please, thanks. So all of the climate change committee scenarios that are modelled are based on a percentage of car kilometres switching to other modes of travel. So in other words, as we move from where we are today, as well as replacing our internal combustion engines with electric vehicles, we also need to make other changes and other shifts in order to hit our targets. And for transport, that's likely to involve some combination of these things. Developing and investing in the infrastructure required to support and encourage more active travel, encouraging greater availability of shared mobility, including micromobility, whose life cycle emissions are lower than shared mobility for larger electric vehicles. And then also planning our communities and cities so that more people have access to the services and the things they need to reach within a short journey from their homes. So this is the basis of the 15-minute city concept, which is really enjoying its moment in the sun right now, thanks to COVID. So next slide, please. Thank you. So of course, as more of our transport becomes electrified, we'll begin to see more convergence between the transport and energy sectors. In the middle here on the house wall, you can see a Tesla Powerwall. It's basically a big battery. It can store 13.5 kilowatt hours of energy, which is more power than the average home uses in a full day. So if you have solar panels on your roof, for instance, you might, for example, use your Powerwall to store excess power on a sunny day. You can also see next to it a Nissan Leaf. Now, the Leaf has a capacity of around 40 kilowatt hours. So you can think of this as an electric vehicle, or you could think of it, when fully charged, as the equivalent of 3 Tesla Powerwalls, storing enough power to run the average home for around 4 days. And this is the concept of V2G, or vehicle to grid, using excess power stored in electric vehicle batteries to provide power back to the grid, or perhaps more locally to a specific building. But while transport and energy are converging, something else interesting is happening in the background. When I talked about invisible measures earlier, I talked about renewable sources of energy such as solar and wind replacing fossil fuels. Now, if you want to reduce the supply of electricity generated through burning coal, for instance, in very simplified terms, you can just chuck a little bit less coal into the power plants. But when you introduce more wind and solar to the grid, you introduce more intermittency of supply because they depend on the weather. So you can't turn the sun up if you want a bit more solar, and you can't turn it down when you want less. However, every moment of every day, a dynamic process is happening to keep the power grid balanced. And balancing the grid refers to ensuring that the electricity supply meets and matches the electricity demand, and doing that in real time or very close to real time. And if electricity supply and demand are unbalanced, then the frequency of the power network is affected. And in the UK, the power network operates at 50 Hertz. Now, if that frequency varies even by just 1%, then that begins to cause damage to the infrastructure and also instability on the network. And in the worst case scenarios, that can lead to blackouts. So intermittent sources of energy give us different things to think about when it comes to grid balancing. But this need to keep the grid balanced doesn't mean that we can't generate more of our power from renewable sources. It just means that we need to enable a system that we can balance in a flexible way and with fast response times. And this is where domestic flexibility services could come in. And this refers to the possibility of domestic customers participating in grid balancing activity. I'm showing two things here which give you some idea of emerging innovations. The Guardian headlines taken from this time last year. Most of us are familiar with Economy 7 and the idea of tariffs for cheaper off-peak electricity. But what is striking about this particular article and this particular scenario is that the cheaper electricity occurred during daytime, so what would normally be considered peak hours. And it happened because it was a particularly sunny and windy day, and overall electricity demand was down because of lockdown. So the grid had an excess. And not only was it cheaper, it was in fact negative pricing. So those who participated were paid to take excess electricity off the grid. On the left is an image of a smart charger. This is a charger which is equipped with intelligence in order to take advantage of time of use tariffs. So it can switch charging on or off at particular moments. And as the name suggests, these are tariffs which charge differently for electricity according to when it's used. So of course, in the future, we may not have today's concepts of what it means to be peak time or off-peak, and instead that concept could be more dependent on wider system conditions than it is on time of day. So this type of product could allow consumers to take advantage of different prices. If the grid needs excess energy removing to keep it balanced, then your vehicle or your home battery could flip into charge mode. And conversely, your car or your home battery could also sell excess energy back into the grid. Next slide, please. So you're all, or many of you at least, myself included, are transport practitioners, and transport has experienced a really extraordinary decade or two of change, and so extraordinary, in fact, that in many circles now, even the word transport has been supplanted by the term mobility. I was looking a few things up last night. Google Maps was founded in February 2005, initially as a desktop product. So it's just had its 16th anniversary. Uber was founded in March 2009, so it's just had its 12th birthday. And Citymapper was founded in 2011, so it's 10 years old this year. And these are all consumer products which have become household names, and that many of us maybe use on a daily or a weekly basis. And the transformations that have been possible in transport have been underpinned by two things. The first of those is data, or more specifically, greater access to data. And the second is digitalization. And this data and digitalization transformation of the energy sector is still very early. So although innovations exist, and you might even have some of them in your home, so for example, smart thermostats or smart meters, many of the things that I've talked about this morning are still very early concepts. So energy is right at the start of the journey that the transport sector has been travelling through for some time now. And as it begins to travel through this journey itself, it will continue to unavoidably transform the transport sector at the same time. Some of you might have come across the term digital twin before. Digital twins are virtual representations of a real-world object or process, and they can be used to run simulations to predict how that object or process might perform under certain conditions. They're used a lot in other sectors outside energy, for instance, to simulate factories or manufacturing processes. But we will now begin to see more development of digital twins in the energy sector. And these digital twins will also attempt to include behaviours of consumers and markets, because, as I outlined earlier, consumer and society change is such an important part of reaching our net zero targets. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thanks. So in the energy industry, we talk a lot about the energy transition. And what we mean by that is the structural change that the energy system is going through from a system based on fossil fuels or non-renewable sources of energy to a system based on renewable energy. But this is not the only transition that we can anticipate will occur. This slide shows the percentage of jobs in what are considered high emitting industries by geographic distribution, regionally in the bar chart on the left, and then broken down by local authority on the right, where the darker red local authorities have the highest proportion. And when change happens in a systemic way, people and communities are left in different positions than their starting point. So the concept of the just transition is really about thinking about how we can ensure that in getting to net zero, the costs and opportunities fall in a way that doesn't leave people behind along the way. Next slide, please. Thank you. So thank you all for listening. I hope I've given you some food for thought in relation to the changes to come, and why many of you as transport professionals will in the next months and years find yourselves morphing into transport and energy professionals. So happy now to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Lucy, for that. It was really interesting and a great way to kick off things. I know we're reasonably short on time on the questions, so please, if you do have any that you'd like to get in the next 9 minutes, then I'd be delighted to hear. I'll kick off with one that is probably something that features quite a bit in transport discussions at the moment in terms of technology, is electric vehicles, and there's quite a lot of discussion about whether they are indeed carbon neutral and will contribute, or what the challenges are with the fact that they do have embedded carbon. So could you, Lucy, maybe share a view on whether EVs are going to deliver the sort of carbon reductions that we need?
I can. I'm sort of thinking about how to address that in the short time we have. So I talked a little bit about life cycle emissions. So I think, and you rightly allude to that in your question, which is that we need to consider the total emissions involved in transport. So this would include obviously manufacturing the vehicle itself, also potentially disposing of or recycling or disassembling a vehicle at the end of its useful life. So I think it is important that we consider these things. Some of the gains we have, or some of the improvements we make in emissions, will come from those parts of the process, as well as the actual points in time in which a vehicle is being used to serve a particular journey. So I do think there is enormous scope to achieve good improvements in those areas as well. I think we will see that through advanced materials, through more optimization of manufacturing processes. I won't name the company, but I'm sure some people here will have heard of it or will be hearing of it. There is a very interesting electric vehicle manufacturer focused actually not on passenger cars, more on larger passenger vehicles such as buses, who are looking at a completely new assembly model based on having lots of much more regional micro factories for assembly. So rather than assembling maybe in one particular part of the world and then shipping those vehicles to different markets, actually assembling many more of them much more locally. So I think we will see huge strides in that area, so yes, I definitely believe that the move to electric vehicles will offer huge advantages and benefits.
Great, thank you very much. So talking about another specific technology as well, I was really interested to see the Tesla massive battery. Do you see that becoming part of conditions for housing development, or can it be integrated into planning in any way like that?
Well, that's a great question. I guess for it to become part of conditions for developments, it would need to be incorporated into relevant buildings regulations or those sorts of things. I could see that becoming a possibility. It's certainly not necessarily an area that I have a lot of expertise in, but I guess I can also see a slightly softer option in which perhaps it's not regulated, but it's encouraged or incentivized in some way. I think what is really interesting when I talk to counterparts working on research and looking at very similar issues to the issues that we're looking at, is how some of these technologies are viewed differently in different markets. So, for instance, in the Nordic countries, if you own a property, for instance, that is not fitted with an electric heat pump, that's seen as a real disadvantage, because it's a desirable thing to have. It's a very useful thing to have. If you don't have one, then the value of your property when you come to sell will be adjusted lower as a result of that, because of perception within that market. We're obviously a long way from that in the UK. Things like electric heat pumps are still largely an unknown quantity. People don't necessarily know what they are or appreciate that many of us will have to have them in our own homes in the coming years. So I think it would be great to get to the point where I guess through softer measures, this sort of thing, these things become adopted and diffused through communities and through society, maybe rather than having to immediately go the route of hard regulation.
Okay. Yeah, and I think linked to that is the question of equity as well. There's been a few questions from the audience, thanks very much, that around the theme of, is it just going to be the richer households that can afford to do this? How do we offer additional support to those that might need to make that transition, or the encouragement to make behaviour change? So have you got examples of where we're able to address equity and fairness in this arena?
Well, so this is certainly one of the things that we will be looking at the Centre for Net Zero. So it's a question we're really interested in. I think it maybe is true to say that we will see the wealthier households perhaps be the earlier adopters for some of these technologies in the absence of funding or support from governments. So these are the people who already have the means to invest in these types of technologies. I think that could be a useful thing, though, in order to help drive down the costs of development and production of some of these technologies. So I think, again, as adoption increases of any kind of new technology, as it becomes more widely used and more mainstream, we tend to find costs fall, but also greater innovation, because more firms will enter that market, seeing a market opportunity. So I think I don't know who asked the question. It's a great question. I haven't really got a very decisive answer for that right now, but your question in itself is one of many reasons that the Octopus Energy has set up the Centre for Net Zero.
That's great, because actually that's a question that's featured from a few audience members in slightly different guises. So I think it's something that as a profession we should be looking at, and clearly is top of mind for quite a few people. I realise we've got reasonably short time, so I just wanted to pick up on a nice broad question for you at the end, and that's thinking about the delays that have happened with COP26 and COVID. What's the level of urgency, and what are the implications if there was a further postponement of the COP26 agenda?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. So I mean, obviously, obviously COVID and all of the delays we've seen around COP and whatever else have not changed the urgency around the climate. So that's not changed at all. I think, certainly we all hope COP can go ahead as planned in November. Whether it will take place as a kind of summit in person or become more of a virtual event or a hybrid event, I guess remains to be seen. But I think certainly, obviously, the UK is leading that summit and is very keen to show some global leadership in this area, and I think is doing exactly that. So the government is pressing ahead with some very important strategies. We know the heat building strategy is very close to being published, I hear through my networks, and also the transport decarbonisation plan and the hydrogen strategy. So I think work continues to go on at pace behind the scenes. I think these conversations will continue to be had, and in many ways, I have no doubt that if COP does end up being a virtual event or a hybrid event, actually, I think there could be a real opportunity there, because I think that is an event that actually could reach a much broader audience of people, and also more general members of the public, as well as policymakers and business and city leaders.
Great. Well, it's a very good positive note to end on, I think. Lucy, thank you very much for your contributions today. And thanks to the audience for their questions as well. Certainly, if we've not covered them, I'll try and make sure we can pick them up in the panel discussion later on. But thank you very much, Lucy.
Thank you all. Enjoy the day. Thanks.
Thank you. And I'd like to keep things moving as well. Thanks to Lucy. We're now going to move on to our next speaker, Ewa Kmietowicz from the Committee for Climate Change. Thanks, Ewa.
Thanks very much, Katie. Hello, everyone, and great to be here today to tell you a little bit about our work for the 6th Carbon Budget. My name's Ewa Kmietowicz. I'm the team leader for transport and land use mitigation at the Committee on Climate Change. I've been here about 8 years now, so it seems that time's gone really quickly. Before that, I was in government working in DEC on other sort of energy related and climate change issues. So I've been working in this area for quite a long time now. Can we just move on one slide, please? Oh, sorry, the next one as well. So I've got a few slides to run through with you today, and these will be based around the key elements of the 6th Carbon Budget report, which was published towards the end of last year. I'm going to start off with running through our recommended path for the 6th Carbon Budget and to set out the key sources of abatement across the economy as a whole. And then I'll drill down a bit further to talk about the surface transport path to net zero, and hopefully leave quite a lot of time for a Q&A at the end. Sorry, just take a drink. So this is the most important sort of high-level slide. Sorry, I've got a cough here, sorry. And this covers the economy as a whole and shows our key recommendation. The headline message, sorry, I think I'm going to have to stop. I've got a really sore throat. Can I come back later? Sorry.
Hi, Ewa. Of course, sorry, of course. I know the feeling.
I just need 5 minutes. Sorry, my throat's gone really dry. I can't speak.
Not at all. We can maybe have a brief sort of introduction to our panel in the meantime while Ewa's having a rest. So nothing like being thrown into it, David, Amshu, Elliot. We've got a couple of questions actually that we didn't get through with the conversation with Lucy that might be useful to pick up now. So if I could all welcome you, and perhaps you'd like to give a brief introduction. Hopefully Elliot can join us too, but let's start with David, yourself.
Hi, yes, thanks Katie. I'm David Connolly. I'm Director of Innovation at Systra Limited, and I've been working on transport emissions for most of my career, which is now over 30 years with MVA Systra. So I've been looking at low emission strategies for a long period of that, both from an air quality perspective and a carbon perspective. And I'm particularly interested in the uptake of EVs, the provision of charging infrastructure for EVs, and other zero emission technologies, and the behaviour that is needed to deliver the overall reduction in transport emissions that we've heard from the other speakers.
Great, thanks. Amshu, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, Katie, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name's Amshu. I'm the Senior Environmental Specialist working at Systra UK. I've joined Systra very recently. My experience is in highway maintenance, but I'm also involved in conservation activities in India. My education background is in renewable energy technology, clean tech, and yeah, so that's me. Thank you.
Thanks, and finally Elliot's here to join us as well.
Hi, morning, Katie. My name's Elliot Shai, Senior Environmental Consultant for Systra. My expertise is in carbon assessments of UK rail infrastructure projects and using the RSSB's rail carbon tool and delivering training on how to use that tool as well. There's a long-standing interest in environment stemming back from Connolly University, and now they're working in the environmental team at Systra.
Great, thank you very much. And certainly Lucy's first conversation prompted quite a lot of questions about EVs, and particularly around the scale of behaviour change that's going to be required. Certainly one of the attendees pointing out it seems like quite a huge level of behaviour change. So what should be the balance between the proverbial carrot and sticks here? And David, maybe you'd like to kick off on some of the sort of behaviour change elements that are required.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. I think that is the biggest problem, is that we don't realise how much we are going to need to change to achieve the relevant pathway. So we can all look at improvements to cycle networks and public transport and hope that that will do it, and trust in EVs, but actually you need a lot more than that. And in the very least, the initial is you need to be persuaded not to buy or use fossil fuel vehicles as soon as possible. So that requires change. But after that, and even with the vehicles that are in the fleet, you will need to be persuaded not to use those vehicles as much as you are at the minute. And that will require, I think, a cost mechanism, a stick basically, to make it that the fossil fuel vehicle is not the cheapest option for almost any journey, because at the minute it's too cheap and it's too easy for those who have access to that technology. So I think there is a shock coming, or an opportunity, depending on your point of view, which is that the cost of the use of fossil fuel vehicles will have to go up relative to the other modes. And some of those modes will be zero emission cars, but actually the big changes will be not making the trip, not making such a long trip, walking, cycling for the short trips, and using other zero emission vehicles for those, whether it's your zero emission vehicle or someone else's in terms of public transport or shared vehicles. So I think that a lot of the local authorities who are signing up to net zero and carbon neutral statements and climate emergency statements are not, I don't think, fully aware of what that will mean for the full how big the stick has to be to get to that by 2030. It gets easier as you go on because you get to an entirely electric fleet, but by 2030 it's going to be quite a change to travel behaviour. The stick has to be quite big, I'm afraid.
And Elliot, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I don't think I can't disagree with anything David said there. The one thing I would add, though, I think that coronavirus and everyone working from home and showing that everyone can work from home with technologies like this, Teams, Zoom, everything like that is going to be a really big help to that. I say I very briefly mentioned the training I deliver for RSSB on the rail carbon tool. Before coronavirus, I'd travel down to London, everyone else would gather in London, we'd hold that all together. Everyone would take 12 hours out of their day to do a 5-hour training course. Now, deliver it from home over Teams. It's a great saving all round. Carbon, time, energy, everything comes together. I think it's a really big and sort of eye opener to how the world can operate, working from home and remotely. We don't all need to be travelling across the country for meetings on a whim, spending lots of money as well as lots of carbon to do so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. But what about EVs specifically? Obviously, got a question here from Anton, and it was around the fact that the EVs may well drop down the travel hierarchy because it's still maybe encouraging car use, by whatever sort of fuel that is, and contributes to congestion and other sort of transport issues that we have to be dealing with. So should we really be promoting electric vehicles, or because they do have other negative impacts? David, something to add on that?
Well, yes, we shouldn't be promoting them, but we should be promoting them more than fossil fuels. I think, look at it the other way, we should be hammering the use of fossil fuel, in fact the purchase of fossil fuel vehicles in the first place, and then the use of those vehicles. There will be some travel and some necessary travel that will require a personal vehicle. It doesn't have to be your personal vehicle. It could be effectively an electric driven taxi. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. It just could come and take you to where you're going. Doesn't then need a parking space. Take someone else for the journey that has to be made, and it will be at a price that is more expensive than the walking and the public transport alternative. But it might be that there are some journeys where the private vehicle will require a private vehicle or a shared small vehicle. So I'm in no way promoting cheaper car use. I'm promoting more expensive car use. And after the balance has been reorganized, the electric vehicle is cheaper than the fossil fuel vehicle, and both of those are more expensive than the other alternatives. And until you get to that point, you will not get the reduction in electric car or fossil fuel car use that you need, basically. So I'm not promoting electric vehicles. I'm just promoting the big stick for fossil fuels. And it's not even I'm promoting it, it's what's necessary, basically.
And we've talked a bit about personal cars, vehicles movements, but what about freight deliveries, HGVs? You know, what can the freight sector, what should the freight sector be doing in terms of carbon? Elliot, have you got anything experience from rail freight particularly?
I think in rail, unfortunately, diesel is the primary mode of transporting heavy freight at the moment, because it is the most efficient. It's the best way of transporting very heavy loads, and that's, I think, obviously electric freight trains they're being promoted, but they're not quite as useful for the heavier loads. I'm not quite sure how it works on the road. I'm not sure if David can better inform on that.
Yeah, well, I think electric's not going to be the solution there. It's definitely going to be hydrogen or other effectively lower emission fuel types, but electric's not likely to do the heavy duty side. So I think the biggest thing that we can do is not what the freight industry can do. I think it's what the government can do. There has to be much more incentive and support to move to a zero emission goods vehicle at the heavier end, and trials of that technology and stuff, because I think the effect of the use of hydrogen is very far in the freight industry and the heavy vehicle engines is very far behind the private car low end. So I think that the government still needs to be supporting that end with trials and packages to make it worth the industry's while, and the existing vehicles that have to be discouraged from making use of the road network with a fossil fuel vehicle, basically by road user charging or equivalent. So I think it's a government thing rather than a freight industry thing. Would be my takeaway headline.
And I've got further questions here as well, of not just again thinking about.
I think Ewa, Kate, I think Ewa was saying she might be available to come back in again.
I see. I think what we might do now we've got into the panel discussion is carry on as we're going. If everybody's okay to do that, then we'll take the sort of half an hour Systra panel discussion now, and Ewa can rejoin us at 10:30 for the final presentation. So if you're happy to continue, and I can see that there are questions coming in, but please, if you've got questions for this panel now, then please do put them in the question box, and I'll do my best to field them, and we'll carry on. So with that in mind, something that's come up is the rural context as well, and you know, we've often these new technologies are talked about and sort of assumed in the urban context, but what's the answer for rural communities, and how do we deliver that sustainable transport there? Have you got anything to add from your experience to kick us off on the rural context?
Yeah, so I would just like to add on what the first speaker, Lucy, was talking about energy intermittency. That would be the problem in, you know, when it comes to the rural context. The infrastructure that is required to support all these new clean technologies is something that's focused very much in the urban area, whereas rural is not something that's looked at, maybe because it's not feasible at this point in time, because the technology is very much new, and the cost of these new technologies would go down only with time. So I would say that is still a challenge as it stands, with developing infrastructure in the rural setting to support all the new technologies that's in the pipeline. But not just in the UK, and even if you look at the global context, that again is the challenge.
Absolutely, I think it's quite interesting, and what best practice we might be able to take from other areas as well. David, were you going to add in something on that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, obviously that the rural areas where public transport and the walking and cycling doesn't work terribly well, obviously you can make sure that you support the local village where, you know, where a proportion of the rural people live in small settlements, to make sure it still has a shop and access to healthcare without a need to drive. But generally you are looking at the use of private vehicles for that. And actually the rural communities almost entirely solve one of the big problems that affects urban areas, which is the lack of off-street parking to charge your own electric vehicles. So actually, as battery range goes up, the rural people aren't necessarily traveling the full length of the country any more than the urban people are. So as long as the battery of the vehicle that they buy and can afford, which are two different questions, they actually have solved the overnight charging problem to a larger extent, in that they don't live in tenement flats by and large, basically. So they quite often have more parking and off-street parking than an urban cousin might have. So actually it's not as big a problem as you think, but it will have to be the use of zero emission long-range vehicles with the ability to pull agricultural, you know, trailers and whatever for the farming people, and the villages have to have the services that avoid the need to drive into, you know, into the faraway town. But they will uptake electric vehicles as quick as the urban, once the battery range is sufficient for their day-to-day use, basically. So I don't think it's as big a problem as people think.
A positive outlook. Elliot, and anything else to share on that?
No, I think I'm sure David have both covered that very well, both sides of the argument.
Good. Well, let's move on and actually return to a conversation. You know, David, you were saying about it's a government issue in some cases, and certainly the impetus on the government to encourage the movement, especially in relation to freight, to lower carbon, net zero. So what can the government do? What is the role of legislation and regulation and policy in this field?
I think ignoring goods for the minute, which is not really my specialism, but I'll come back to it in a minute anyway. That's never stopped me talking about something. I think the price of fossil fuel and road user, the sort of use of the road both to drive on and to park vehicles on, is too cheap, basically. So you need to get back to the point where the fossil fuel vehicle is not the cheapest option. That's fiscal measures, basically rising duty on fossil fuels. Discouragement from buying a fossil fuel vehicle, so not just asking people nicely, but actually making it more expensive with tax bans and all the rest of it. So, and there is a big question, which is how do you replace the fuel duty as you move away from fossil fuel, so that you don't move to a very cheap electric supply and no tax revenue. So that then takes into road user charging. So they should be looking at ensuring that there is enough revenue to replace the fossil fuel tax for when you phase out fossil fuel tax. In the meantime, you are doing all you can to encourage the uptake of other vehicles without spending money incentivizing something that will happen on its own, which is now probably the case with private vehicles, and being brave enough to say the carbon cost is going to become a bigger part of your petrol bill than it is at the minute, because at the minute it's too cheap to drive and burn fossil fuels, in my humble. In terms of the good side, I think it is promoting that technology, because I think it's unfair to expect individual vehicles. There are things like collective purchasing schemes that you could get the vehicle manufacturers to set up and take notice if you coordinated purchase of those vehicles rather than somebody buying one or two. Can you coordinate that? And whether that's local government or a regional authority or a central government is to be determined. But I think there's bulk buying of technology just to make it, you know, at that goods vehicle end, whether that's hydrogen or whatever. But I think that the goods vehicles will catch up with zero emission technology, but it's always has been behind the private car electric vehicle, which is, the technology is a lot further advanced, basically.
And what's the view from the panel about how committed the government is to introducing some more of these measures? Elliot, do you want to start off with that?
Very sceptical that the government really wants to do enough. I think they're more interested in staying in power rather than doing anything that's going to do anything to tackle really climate emergency. The point I was going to make, similar to David's, is whether they're not doing enough to make using cars more expensive. They're not doing enough to make public transport cheaper, I think, as well. It needs to be, say, to drive to London, is much cheaper than getting the train, and that's something that needs to be a balance there to make sure people can make that choice to get the train, to get the bus, which also can be very expensive for short journeys as well, rather than driving into town and parking. Because I know from my experience living, I live in a city and it's got reasonable transport links, but it is still much cheaper and easier for me to get to drive than it is to get the bus. It's very expensive for a short 10-minute journey into town. But that sort of thing, it comes back to personal choice as well, of course. But that sort of thing needs to be really thought of and how it can be improved.
Okay. And actually, what's your view in terms of government interest and ability to influence?
I think the Prime Minister's 10-point action plan on the energy. So that clearly sort of outlines the efforts that's planned for the next coming years to sort of meet the 2050 target. I agree with what they're doing, but we also need to make sure the electricity that actually gets used by these electric vehicles will have to be completely clean. Otherwise, it just defeats the objective. And if we just look beyond the electric cars, the components that are needed to make these electric cars, the minerals and the rare earth elements, to meet the sort of the decarbonizing strategy in the Western world, it's actually adding a little bit stress on the Far Eastern world, because these rare earth elements are not really mined anywhere in the Europe or America. It's mostly in China and India, and this mining activity is adding tremendous stress on the evergreen rainforest. And that is something I don't think many of us realize. When we see electric car, we see it as completely clean. But if you look at the complete life cycle of it, which Lucy was explaining, there are some elements which we aren't addressing at the moment. And not just electric cars, even the green infrastructure, things like wind turbines, the neodymium, the rare earth element that's needed for a permanent magnet in the wind turbine. To get enough of that, we would have to mine an area that's half the size of a football ground. So that really tells us about the scale of impact the decarbonizing strategy has. So and that's where the offsetting element sort of comes into picture. So our offsetting effort should be focused more on regenerating these tropical rainforests so that it strikes a balance. Yes, it cleans the air here, but it also sort of recycles the emission levels in the place where all this manufacturing is happening. So that's sort of my
offsetting can have a big role to play then in terms of meeting the carbon objectives.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I just want to touch from sort of a corporate sustainability point, if I may, since we have time. So when we do talk about reducing carbon emission from businesses, the first thing that we look at is decarbonizing our entire operational emission and supply chain alike. And this could be, moving from anything that has huge fossil fuel dependency. But we must understand that the transition that's taking place is slow. It's going to happen in a few years. So even if we make investment in green technology right now, it's not really going to stop the climate change at this point in time. So there is still efforts that needs to happen. So offsetting is an option that can solve this issue. So decarbonizing economy, again, I'm using that word very much. Switching to renewables on a huge scale would bring in its own problem. So offsetting is something that we need to look at, specifically where we offset. It is an important thing, and that should be debated very much. And we also lack framework on offsetting carbon emission. And that's something the government will have to look at.
Thanks, Amshu. I want to sort of stay on planning policy a little bit as well, because we had a few questions around that, and particularly whether there are views about the consistency with COP26 objectives and the national planning framework. Does the panel have any view on whether the sort of delivery of those outcomes on land use planning are consistent with the themes that are being promoted through COP26? It's challenges around, shorter term local plans, housing allocations, etc. Are they at odds with what we're trying to do in the COP26 agenda?
In a word, yes. I think the UK and England in particular has been very slow and very poor at sorting out its interactions between transport and planning to make sure that planning is sustainable. And we should all be thinking that every development every new development is a 20-minute neighbourhood or a 15-minute neighbourhood, if i.e. you have everything you need within a sustainable mode within a 15-minute journey time. That's a lot easier to do with a new development, but it still isn't. I mean, it's getting better in England, I think it's fair to say, and other nations in the four nations, but it is not strong enough, basically. So I think new developments is where you can do the most good in terms of reducing the need for car dependency. Yep. And it's a lot harder to retrofit that 20-minute concept. It's not impossible, but again, there's planning mechanisms to allow the good local shop and the primary school and the health facility to remain within the community or to reappear in the community where it isn't there at the minute, because you do need the services to be part of it. It's not just the transport or the blocking the roads off and making walking and cycling easier. You need to have somewhere you can walk and cycle to, basically. So I think the planning, it could be strengthened. It's not, again, I'm not a planner, but it is, I think, surprising how little the planning worries about the car generation of those extra houses that are definitely needed. Obviously, people need houses, and the population needs somewhere warm, comfortable, easy to heat, and good energy housing. But you can't then go out and jump in your car to drive to the supermarket or the primary school. So I think, yes, planning needs to do more, needs to step up and do more in the UK as a whole. Absolutely. Yeah.
Great, I can see some nods along with that. So I'll just try and move on to one other question before we go back to Ewa, and then if there is more time at the end, we can also return, because I know there's been a lot of questions here. This one is a little bit more specific, but you talked about the sort of road user charging and other mechanisms that might be in place to address the fuel duty deficit. How quickly do you think we might see mechanisms like that come in?
How quickly are the politicians willing to admit and state out loud that that's part of their policy, basically? I think if it was transport planners were in charge, it would happen a lot quicker than it's with politicians, I think. So it's how quick can you get a politician who is worried about his next election to make something more expensive than it is at the minute? Is a question for the other panelists could answer, but I think the politicians are not likely to do it quick enough. I think there's
a huge opposition from the public for that sort of thing as well. I remember I was living in Manchester when they proposed implementing the scheme. I think it was rejected very close to 80-20. It was massively rejected. We're talking a good 10-15 years ago now, but I think there would still be similar objections. People go, I don't want to pay that. And they don't think about what the wider benefits are. They immediately go, oh no, more money going out of my bank. No, absolutely no chance. But it's the sort of thing that has to happen.
And you can do it with fuel duty to a certain extent. You can just make it quite a bit more expensive that actually you think about the fuel price of a journey before you make it. Whereas at the minute you don't. I mean, it's slightly hard because you don't pay for every journey and you don't perceive the fuel. But the news of the budget was how much the fuel duty escalator had gone up this budget, it would put it in your mind that I don't need a car. Why am I using a car? There are other ways. This is too expensive, and that's both on the purchase of the car in the first place, the maintenance or the ownership of that car, and the price of the fossil fuel that it burns. All have to be part of the mode choice. And at the minute, they're not, basically. It's everything.
And I think, again, going back to coronavirus, I think we're a two-car family here, and I think we sort of realised with coronavirus we probably could get away with one car. And I think that might be the case for a lot of people going forward as well. And that might, again, be a really big unintentional consequential benefit of coronavirus.
Yeah, and I think if there was a lot more use of shared vehicles, so you don't have a car for the journeys that you don't need a car for, but you have easy access either through a car club or a taxi that is done via an Uber type app, or everyone comes and is electric and is zero emission, takes you where you need to go back from the shops, or in addition to the public transport, it's having the car. Once you've got the car, it's very hard to stop using it. So if you can make it that you don't think you need a car because it's so expensive, but you have access to a car for when you do need it, because I think there are times when you cannot do a journey sensibly without buses and a set of stuff from IKEA or whatever it is. And on that, you make use of shared vehicles, public transport, car clubs, whatever it is, all zero emission, and go about your business as you see fit, basically, but not having boxes of metal sitting about clogging up somebody else's road space for hours at a time for a vehicle that you then jump into for something you should have walked for. Well, tackle car ownership and the rest will follow.
Certainly, sort of license figures continue to fall in younger age groups, so maybe we will see a shift in usership rather than ownership. So we will see. I'm conscious of time, and it's been a really interesting discussion so far. Thank you for contributions from everybody, and indeed thank you for the questions as well. There's quite a lot that we probably haven't been able to cover. I apologise for that, but it's given us plenty of ideas for sort of forthcoming seminars as well. And as I said, we'll return to it if we can do. But if Ewa's there, I would like to invite her to return and deliver her presentation. And we may revisit you at the end, but if not, thank you very much, panelists.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Katie, and sorry everyone about the change in the agenda that just then. So I'll continue with the fourth slide. So if you just move on for one. So this is the most important slide from our carbon budget report last year, which I was telling you about. And it shows the recommended path for the 6 carbon budget to 2050. And the headline message is that by 2035, the UK needs to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 78% on 1990 levels. And this is a really ambitious scenario. If you remember, the previous target before net zero was for an 80% reduction by 2050. This implies basically that we've brought that really ambitious scenario forward by 15 years. And it's a big challenge across all sectors. We set out in our report, we set out the science behind this recommendation and the fact that it's a fair and ambitious contribution to the Paris Agreement, and that it limits UK's contribution to global warming to 2 degrees but also keeping options in play to 1.5 degrees. A really important thing about this chart is that it's front-loaded. It's got an inverted S shape, which means that most of the reduction happens, well, 60% of the reduction happens in the next 15 years, and 40% of the reduction in the following 15 years to 2050. It requires really a strong investment in early investment in low carbon technologies, and this can help to support the recovery. And investment reaches around £50 million per year by 2030, which opens up options by this front-loading aspect. It also includes emissions from international aviation and shipping, which are currently in carbon budgets, and also from peatlands, which currently aren't fully represented in the inventory. So if we move on. So how is this pathway going to be achieved? It looks like a really big ask, and it is a big ask if you compare it to the business as usual, which is the top of the line in this chart. But starting from, we split this into 4 different chunks of abatement, and starting from the top, the first thing that you can do is to reduce demand for the most carbon intensive activities. So instead of driving, you can walk or cycle, you can cut meat consumption, or you can fly a bit less. And energy efficiency is also really important. not just for buildings, but for car efficiency and resource efficiency across the economy as a whole. And that gets you through the first two blocks of that chart. But the single biggest thing that gets you there is electrification, and that's shown in the orange wedge. We need EVs in place of ICE vehicles, which we've been talking about, but also heat pumps instead of gas boilers. We also need other forms of low carbon energy that's not electricity, so hydrogen and bioenergy with CCS are a big part of this story. The third block, which is the blue shaded area, is around decarbonising the electricity we have today. So even though it's more than 50% low carbon today, it needs to fully decarbonise by around 2035. And the last wedge is carbon storage solutions. So this is the net bit of the net zero target. So whether these are nature-based solutions such as afforestation or peatland restoration, or engineered greenhouse gas removals such as direct air capture. And yeah, if we go on to the next slide, please. Yeah. So I know Lucy had a similar slide like this on, which shows the extent of behaviour change in our scenarios. But it's a really important point to sort of stress, because we're not going to be able to deliver net zero if we think it's all about technology and supply side challenges. We've demonstrated in our scenarios the importance of people in this transition, and this pie chart really demonstrates that. It shows that about 2/5 of the abatement can be delivered by low carbon technologies. So Lucy was talking about this as well, which are the sorts of things that you don't really notice. So electrification of the power grid and use of existing technologies. But the rest of it, so around 60%, involves some element of behaviour change. And this is split, you can think of in two chunks. The orange wedge, which is pure behaviour change that people need to make. So this is things like changes in diets and not flying so much. And the rest of it is the pink wedge, is where you're bringing together new technologies and behaviour change to cut emissions. So you're plugging in your car rather than filling it up at a petrol station. You're using a heat pump instead of a gas boiler. So they're not necessarily major changes that people need to make, but they do need to adapt to the ways of doing things. And it's really important that we recognise this really important contribution that people play, and we need to start this conversation of how they can be involved in this conversation and this dialogue, and that the path is underpinned by fairness and consensus. And the committee have actually going to be working in this area a bit more often, a bit more in depth in the coming year, where we're doing a work stream on how to engage people, and also on the just transition, so what that looks like. So that will be a really interesting task, not just for us, but for anyone working in this space. So if we move on. So yeah, so the next slides cover in a bit more depth the surface transport trajectory and what needs to happen in surface transport, which you probably all know about, but I'll just go through some of the key numbers. And this chart shows the balanced pathway, which is the pathway we use to base our recommendations on for the surface transport sector. And it shows that we need to reduce emissions by 70% in surface transport by 2035. And that's a really big ask, given that surface transport emissions, apart from last year under COVID, have been flat for over a decade, despite the improvements that we've had to new car and van efficiency. So it really demonstrates the scale of the challenge in surface transport, that we need to almost also get to nearly gross zero emissions by 2050. There's only 1 megaton left by 2050 in this balanced pathway. So if we move on, this shows how the abatement wedges and how we see this being achieved for this sector. So starting from the top again, car travel demand is reduced by about 9% in this pathway by 2035 and 17% by 2050. So this is well, I'll go into the key elements of that in a minute, but you know, it's really important also to realise that van and HGV logistics can also play a big role in that through things like telematics and improved routing and reduced empty running. So we've also looked at that in our demand reduction scenarios. But the biggest chunk of abatement is from electrification of cars, vans and HGVs. And that's shown in the next three chunks, so the green, blue and the orange chunks. The take-up of zero-emission cars and vans reaches 100% by 2032 in our scenario, and leads to 25 million BEVs on the road by 2035 and about 3 million PHEVs. So HGV acceleration needs to happen really rapidly because that's starting further behind than for cars. So we're looking for testing and trial large-scale demonstration of HGV technologies to start in the next few years, and for take-up and rapid take-up in the 2030s, reaching nearly 100% by 2040, and that shows the orange wedge here. And then there's a smaller chunk of other emission sources that can be decarbonised, such as rail and off-road vehicles too. So I don't know if you can see that sort of pinkish chunk there, and they're really important too. Improvement of efficiency of conventional vehicles and continued use of biofuel use also play a role, particularly in that transition period before we fully decarbonise the fleets. And the next couple of slides dig a bit deeper into some of these elements. So shall we move on? Thank you. The first of these, I thought it would be worth showing you the key elements of our demand reduction scenario for cars. And we see this coming from three different sources. So we've seen under COVID that societal and technology behaviour changes can play a big role. So things like increasing working from home and use of IT, as well as continued trends in internet shopping and e-commerce. The second element is moving from cars to more sustainable modes such as walking, cycling and use of public transport. And while walking trips have increased in recent years, cycling has been relatively flat and bus trips have declined. So this needs to be addressed and really incentivised in a systematic and fully funded way. And the third element is to increase car occupancy. And we've seen things like car and ride sharing happen through the various apps now available. Lucy was talking about mobility rather than transport, and this is really conceptualized in sort of increasing car occupancy rates. And all of these elements require significant changes to people's behaviour than they do now, but we have seen it during the COVID crisis, and remains to big shifts that people are already making in the way they use cars and public transport. So we'll see if we can. It's really important to try to harness that and to sustain it over the longer term. So if we move on, so I set out just now that the really big element that leads to most of the emissions reduction in surface transport is scaling up of electric vehicles and electrifying the fleets. And so this chart shows the profile for take-up of electric cars and HGVs. So starting with electric cars on the left-hand side, I mean, they've been a long time in the making, and even now they only represent about 6% of all new car sales, and they need to rise, as I said, to 100% by 2032 in our balanced pathway. And this requires drivers to get used to new technology, but to overcome things like range and charging anxiety. And it needs to happen really quickly. It's not just in the first, that the rapid transition over the next few years needs to reach not just the innovators and early adopters, but to mass market. And the zero carbon market for HGVs is much less developed than that of cars. And there are three current options that are in trials throughout the world. So we've got hydrogen, battery electric with ultra-fast chargers, and battery electric with catenary systems. And our balanced pathway has a mix of these for different segments of this quite diverse market. And what our report recommends to government is that we need large-scale demonstrations in the next few years, and these should be taken up in the late 2020s, when we've got an established technology pathway and reached nearly 100% of sales by 2040. And this is a big ask for the sector, not just for the individual drivers who need to get used to the technology, to work out how this fits with their business model and, crucially, their delivery cycle. But as the range of battery electric technologies increases over the next few years, we expect that the vast majority of trips will be long enough, will be able to be served by electric vehicles. And so to eliminate the sorts of barriers that we're seeing now around range anxiety, for example. Okay, so we'll move on. So this is the last slide that I wanted to share with you, and it's around the cost of delivery. At the economy-wide level, we estimate that net costs will be less than 1% of GDP, and these are lower than our previous estimates of 1 to 2%. And that's really due to the faster cost reductions we've seen of key technologies such as batteries and offshore wind. But this chart is for the surface transport costs. And looking at the chart on the right, above the axis, we have investment costs, which rise to about 12 billion a year by 2035. And this includes public and private investment, and that covers purchase of vehicles, as well as installation of charging infrastructure and grid upgrades. And the section below axis gives you the cost savings that results from that. And in our assessment, there'll be substantial savings for cars and van users. We expect electric vehicles to be cost savings to society, excluding taxes and duties, from around 2025. And this is driven by decreasing battery costs and also the fact that EVs are more efficient than conventional vehicles. There's also the potential for lower maintenance costs due to electric drivetrains having fewer moving parts, so those are factored in as well. We have larger fuel savings, as I mentioned, through greater efficiency, both of cars, but as well also of trains, and demand reduction and efficiency improvements of new vehicles. So the key message from this chart is that the operational costs outweigh the required investment costs by around 2030, delivering a net saving from the surface transport decarbonisation pathway to society. And in addition to the emissions reduction, it also delivers other benefits, such as improved health through active travel, better air quality, reduced congestion, and all of these things we haven't actually quantified in our scenario, but we have tried to highlight them qualitatively. And an important point, and for the cost story for the 6 carbon budget, is that surface transport is the only sector where we do have these net cost savings, and this, that's really important, because it should really make it a lot easier for this transition to happen in a way, although there are obvious barriers to overcome to enable these to be achieved. If you look at the long term and the whole picture, if this positive story on costs is delivered, it should make it cheaper and easier for all people who need to move around, and goods as well. So that brings us to the end of what I had to share with you, and I'm happy to try and answer any of your questions.
Thank you very much, and we have about 10 minutes left to do that. So there have been some questions coming in, and one of the ones I wanted to start with was a slightly more technical one, but just looking at the reductions that you're estimating in vehicle kilometres and car demand. Is that actually an absolute reduction, or is it actually in the context of rising background demand? Could you just clarify on that one for us?
Yes. So the figures that I mentioned going through the presentations were for a 17% reduction, and that's relative to a rising business as usual. But if you actually look at where we are now, that also requires a reduction per person of about 3 to 5% per decade. So both of them are in fact needed.
Okay. And so do you think there is sufficient weight on the other sort of what would you say, the other non-climate benefits of road pricing, for example, to be able to achieve reductions in road traffic?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, it's very difficult to estimate, to actually quantify some of these benefits. That's why we were reluctant to do that. But there is, we have done a little bit of work in this area, and I know that other bodies are doing similar work. I think local authorities and transport planners and delivery bodies do recognise these benefits. And when they're looking at how they want a vision for traffic in their area, I think it's really important to take those things into account. Mm-hmm. And I think that is one thing that local people really want to see: good air quality and quiet streets and area and neighbourhoods that are pleasant to walk through and have a lot of green space. So although we can't, set out all of that in our reports because we necessarily take a sort of a high-level picture, I think that's really important when you're delivering these things on the ground, and local authorities and other bodies can actually do that in probably more detail than we're able to.
Yeah, absolutely. Just thinking again about the sort of the scenarios as well. How are manufacturing and maintenance costs of surface vehicles included? Are they part of the balanced pathway or somewhere else in that budgeting?
So you mean the emissions from them?
I think, yeah, the carbon costs of manufacturing and maintenance. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So the industry emissions will contain the profile for manufacturing cars, as well as the steel used or other materials. So that will be part of the decarbonisation pathway for the industry sector. But to the extent that we import a lot of cars to this country, that they will actually be in our consumption emissions, which we're also very mindful of, that we need to reduce not just our production emissions, which are counted in the inventory, and that's the basis for the UNFCCC process, but also consumption emissions are really important. And we do have we did look at this in the 6th carbon budget and tried to estimate what our consumption emissions are now and would be under the 6th carbon budget pathway, but it's quite difficult to do because it's really complicated. But we're very sort of cognizant of the fact that a lot of people are talking about things like border carbon adjustments for for goods that are coming into the country from higher carbon emitting sectors or countries that haven't got detailed decarbonisation plans. And I think that's one way forward to try and push, you know, this in terms of international progress on setting out on other countries, you know, setting out detailed plans for decarbonisation too.
Yeah, in terms of your sort of international best practice and looking more globally, are there good examples, countries that you look to, or that you're sharing knowledge and experience with in terms of shifting away from fossil fuels?
Yes, definitely. We've now got an international sector within the CCC. So we've got analysts that are going around speaking to various countries, sharing good practice. We've actually been involved in the COP EV Transitions Council, which is a high-level ministerial group, which is going to be reporting on EV transitions for the COP. So we're trying to influence that in terms of, you know, telling them about the UK evidence, both on, you know, the speed of transition that's needed, but also, you know, the more positive story that I showed at the end there about, you know, the net savings that could ensue from pursuing that pathway. So yeah, we are trying to do that.
Right, that's really good. There are quite a few sort of specific questions. We've got 5 more minutes left. If there are other things that people would like to get in now, please do put your questions forward. And I think I'd like to return to one from the earlier that I also put to Lucy, and that's about the level of urgency and, again, the sort of postponement of COP26. If there were further delays, what are the implications of that? How does that affect your work?
I suppose it's a good question. I mean, the COP process is sort of separate from where we are, but obviously if something happened to, I don't know, to dilute or water down the Paris Agreement, then obviously that would have a big implication, but hopefully that won't happen. I think if the COP is delayed by up to half a year or even a year, hopefully that won't make too much difference. I'm probably not the best placed person to speak about that because it's not really my area. But in terms of, you know, in terms of the science and the climate, in terms of the climate science and the need for action, that's not going to be any less urgent. You know, we need to all act now, and you know, we're all really aware of the urgency that's really been evident over the last 2 years or so. It's really picked up, and that's not going to go away, irrespective of the political process.
Eva, someone who's closer, sorry, Katie, cutting in, somebody who's closer to the political decision makers, do you have faith and trust in, because I was being fairly negative about the politicians, you are working with them probably closer than I am. Would you say that's an area of hope that they actually are going to grab the nettle?
So, I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Well, we are independent, so we don't work directly with ministers, but obviously we do talk to the departments. And, you know, from the work that we've been, you know, from what I've been hearing from DFT, I have seen a massive shift over the last year or so. And I think, you know, they have set out really ambitious, you know, targets. I mean, less sort of detailed policy, but I think they have got a really high level ambition for decarbonising surface transport. So, you know, in terms of the dialogue that I'm seeing in DFT, I think that has been a seismic shift over the past year or so. I think less so in other departments. For example, I also cover land use and agriculture, and in DEFRA it's been much more difficult to get any dialogue going with them, to be honest. So I think it's varied. I think it's really led by the Secretary of State and the ambitions from the top.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to note the differences there, especially at the earlier conversations we were having about planning policy and the interaction between land use and transport planning again as ever. So David, thanks for your additional question there. And I think I'd like to finish on that fairly positive note in terms of progress being made. That there have been some really excellent contributions across the panel and the speakers. So thank you very much for that. And thanks also to the audience who've been really active on the questions. I'm sorry if I've not been able to get through to them, but as I said, it's certainly picked up some further themes that we might want to look at, particularly maybe delving into the detail of different modes that might be able to play a role in reducing carbon emissions if we were to look for a mode shift, not just to active modes, but other mechanisms, and also that we can also spend a lot more time thinking about behaviour change, because clearly that's absolutely critical to delivery of these targets. And I think there's probably a whole seminar to be had on how we encourage further behaviour change and what mechanisms are in place there. So thank you all very much for attending. Just a reminder that the link from this session will be emailed around to attendees a few hours after we finish up here today, and will also be available on the Landor YouTube channel. And also a further plug for the future sessions in this series. As Boris said, we're going to have one hopefully once a month in the run up to COP26, and the next one will be on May the 20th, and then there'll be a further one on June the 24th. So look out for details of those. So thanks again for everybody's time today, and wish you all a good morning. Thank you.
Cheers, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Katie.
Thank
Cheers.
you.
Bye. Bye-bye.